Question one.
Question number one.
Mark, is the whiskey in the bottle 100% the age listed, or can it be a certain percentage of something younger? Great question.
Great question. And I like to throw it, toss it. I think the answer is it usually almost 100% of the time in most countries the answer is yes, it's true. If you have a 12-year-old Scotch,
Yep.
not a drop of it can be younger than 12 years old.
It can be older.
It can be older.
But it cannot be younger.
Cannot be younger. If you have a 10-year-old bourbon, not a drop can be younger than 10 years old. So that age statement is absolutely correct. There's a few exceptions.
Tell us about them.
They're not necessarily used very often, but certainly with Canadian whiskey, you can have a little bit of an younger spirit. So for example, a Canadian whiskey distiller might bottle something at 20 years, but that might be too sweet, so they want to kind of mellow it out with something really with younger. It's only up to 9%, and it's not like a cost savings or anything. It's more used as a way of kind of making more creative whiskey. So I guess Canada's probably the exception to that rule. Your American whiskey category, so if it's not a straight rye, not a straight bourbon, it could potentially have something else in there. Food coloring, flavoring, anything really. But for the most part, almost single malt Scotch, bourbon, rye, Irish whiskey, Japanese whiskey, you name it, pretty much age statement on the bottle is accurate. And even with Canadian whiskey, age statements are pretty rare, up until recently.
That's right.
So it hasn't really been an issue. If you buy a Canadian whiskey, typically it doesn't have an age statement on it anyway.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. That kind of came along with almost what we've seen lately, which is like sort of the premiumization of Canadian whiskey to compete better, I guess, with the single malt category. And
Yeah.
Great question.
Absolutely. Are smoky whiskeys infused with real smoke?
That's a good question. Another one, smoky whiskey. So when we say smoky whiskeys, what we're usually referring to is peat.
Yeah.
So originally peat, well, it's funny, I guess it depends on what your definition of infused is, because what we're looking at when we have a peaty whiskey is the malt has been smoked with the peat, which used to be sort of the heat source for drying the malt when you're going through the malting process. So you're getting those smoky notes actually from the barley itself, which I guess have been infused with smoke. So yeah. But in no way, shape, or form, peated whiskeys would you be adding any kind of infusion like a tea bag or anything like you would in gin after it's been distilled.
Yeah, so like a smoked cocktail, smoked gin, where you would do it after the fact.
Yeah.
Your core ingredient before you even make any alcohol.
Yes.
That's the part that's been infused, the barley.
The barley. Yes.
And everything else that's it. That's all you can do. I mean, it's Scotch, it's whiskey. You can't do anything else with that whiskey.
That's right.
You can't smoke it any other way.
You cannot. Interesting to note, though, the peatiness level sort of before distillation and after distillation is sometimes different. So always good to kind of figure out and each brand sometimes goes about which number they use. So if you're into peaty whiskeys or if you're getting into peaty whiskeys, always good to keep in mind that you might want to find out whether or not your ppm, which is your phenol parts per million, is after the fact or before the fact, because that will sort of impact how smoky it is.
Yeah, that's true. Like a Balmore is like a 25 parts per million or whatever, and like a Lafroig is like 50 or 45, something like
50,
that.
Yep. Or an Octomore.
Octomore is like 280.
Will fill your entire apartment with the smell.
You walk in, it's in your face.
It's the one you smell the next day.
Yeah, so it all depends, and of course, age, how old the whiskey is, also affects the smokiness, because as it ages, the less smoke is apparent, typically.
Indeed.
There's also different smoke levels. Belvanese is a Highland,
exactly. So the kind of peat that you're using actually makes a difference as well. So do your research.
This is a rabbit hole. This is clearly a rabbit hole.
We're going down the Wikipedia. We just keep pressing all those link buttons, and now we've opened 34 tabs.
I feel like the answer should be like, yes, and then move on.
In short, yes.
Just
the malt is infused with the smoke.
At the barley stage.
The barley stage.
Not anywhere after.
Not anywhere
fermented. And that's pretty kind of amazing because they ferment it, they distill it, they age it in barrels, they bottle it, and that smokiness makes it through every single step of the way.
TLDR, yes.
Yes. All right, over to
All right, let's do. This is a really great question, actually, and I don't know the answer to it, and we can hash this out a little bit. But how is the changing climate change whiskeys, flavor, ingredients, etc.? So, in this sort of age of climate change, what are we seeing that's happening now, or potentially maybe also what could we be seeing in the future?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, that's also a very let's start off with the easy answer. When things are warmer, when the climate's warmer or drier or what have you, that does affect the barrels. You know, you and I like to say the barrel's kind of its own little atmosphere. It's got its own kind of semi-permeable membrane. Things come out, things come out. Usually it's alcohol and water that comes out. If it's a very, but alcohol usually comes out first. So if you go to Scotland, your ABV, your alcohol content goes down. If you're in Kentucky, though, it goes up in most parts of the warehouse, and that's because it's the warehouses are very dry. So water is the first thing to come out of that barrel. So, you know, taking it to this extreme, hot climate whiskeys in like Thailand and India, parts of India certainly are very hot. And so instead of aging something for 12 years, you age it for 2 or 3 years. So I think climate change is making it cheaper to make whiskey.
Could be. Depends on the way the weather goes, I guess.
And of course, I mean, grain shortages certainly there's a whole other problem with weather, climate change, and certainly that. But yeah, overall, it does matter.
Well, absolutely, it will matter for sure. So let's take care of our environment.
Yes. All right. Nope, I have no thoughts on that.
Going to opt out of that question.
Well, Jamie,
yes.
What are your thoughts of Mexican whiskeys?
Tequilas?
Tequilas.
I love tequila.
Yes.
Tequila's
not a
wonderful.
whiskey though.
Not a whiskey.
No, but I mean, it is fermented, distilled, and it is sometimes aged in barrels.
Agreed.
So
but it is not made from a grain. There we go.
So it's not the same starting point.
That's right. So it's made from the agave plant. So same sort of process in terms of distillation, but not the same beginnings to it. I love a lovely tequila. Actually, some of these aged tequilas do actually take on that sort of whiskey flavor profile.
They do.
They quite lovely oakiness to it, some sweetness, and I think that if you had like a really lovely aged tequila, you could probably put it into a lineup with some whiskeys, like do a blind tasting and just trick everyone, because some of them are so. Same with rums, some super old rums that you could mess people right up. Maybe that should be our next tasting with our friends. Let's see if we can muck anyone up. We'll be like, it's a whiskey tasting, and then throw in like a really crazy tequila that has all those whiskey flavors. But I'm a big fan. Tequila highballs are really, really lovely. And just even a tequila neat. What about you? Are you a tequila fan?
Yeah, I am. Tequila's one of those things where there's in many markets, like 10 years ago, there was like only a few brands of tequila.
Yeah.
And they were like, I've had a little too much shots at the club, quote unquote. And you're like, I'm done with tequila.
You gotta put the like
little
lime in,
and
you
you
gotta
lick
blah,
it. You don't do that anymore. I mean, I would if I was still 20.
Right.
But I mean, and no judgment if you are, because certainly you and I have done that as well. More recently than we care to admit. However, I really like the mezcal category. And the mezcal is
smoky.
And it doesn't have to be, but mezcal, like with whiskey, with Scotch, the agave is smoked, and they actually do it in these pits. So they put all the agave plant under the ground, and they smoke them with a local smoking plant type thing. I don't know what it's called because I don't know anything about tequila beyond this. So they smoke it, they dry that agave, and then they make whiskey out of it. Or makes tequila out of it. And it's nice and dry, and it's just the smokiness kind of stays through just the same. So yeah, I'm a big fan of tequilas, mezcals.
Absolutely.
Mezcals is kind of like a broader category for tequila.
Yeah. Well-made spirit, I think, can be enjoyed in this sort of sipping category. Yeah. Or throw a couple ice cubes in there, a nice margarita.
Nice.
Nothing wrong with that.
I like that.
All right, Mark. This is a highly controversial question. All-time favorite single malt Scotch. don't forget who you're sitting with right now. No, I'm just kidding. I'm totally kidding.
I have a lot of thoughts on this. Yeah. They're a whole station. I get asked this all the time. I can never have a favorite whiskey. I feel like that's if I did. I feel like I have a favorite beer and I have a favorite wine, and it's not a type of wine or a beer. I'm just like, we say this all the time. I like a high proof IPA. If I go to a bar, I don't care where it's from. I mean, I do care a little bit, but I just generally, if I'm at a bar, I don't not frequent recently, I'm just like, just give me the high proof IPA, and I like that. If I go to a restaurant, I want a dry red. Earthy, dry red, whatever, that's fine. I don't even know what those words mean together, but that's what I like.
Generally, you get what you want when you ask for that.
Exactly. I've learned over time that use these words together and I'll get something.
And you'll get something you like, very smart.
With whiskey, I'm not that way. I enjoy a whiskey I'm drinking, but I don't necessarily, but I'm also every day I want to taste something different. So I don't have my jam. Yeah.
No, I'm the same way, and I think people who've listened for a long time sort of know we sort of jump all over the place. When we started the podcast, Mark was like the single malt guy, and I came in as like the bourbon person. Like we both sort of had, were representing different categories, and Mark introduced me to a lot of single malts. I introduced him to some bourbons, and so I think, it depends on the day, depends on the context, depends on the moment, depends on. Right now, Four Roses is just hitting the spot, right?
Absolutely.
So couldn't ask for anything better in this moment, right here, right now. So that's a tricky question.
It is.
And there's some that are great single malts or great whiskeys that you like for no other reason than it reminds you of something, or like you had a great experience with it, or there was a great special moment that you had with someone with that whiskey. So that's another thing to take into account. So all-time single malt might not be the best single malt you ever had. It might be the one that you had the most fun with. Like could be any old thing, but you just had like the best night, and you're just like you just love that one so much because it reminds you of that. So
totally agree. I think there's lots you can name that are like the memories you have with whiskeys.
Totally.
A wonderful thing. That's a great
100%.
Point. All right.
We're making such a mess in here.
Well, I guess this is a good. No, this is so whiskeys are now aged in wine barrels. Is this a new trend as distilleries try to compete?
I think. Well, first of all, there's a lot of new sort of cask finishes that are coming out right now, and I think wine definitely being one of them. Canadian whiskey-wise, you've got Gretzky's who's doing the red wine barrels. You got Glenfiddich who's doing ice wine barrel finishes. We've got a port finish at Balvenie. There's Madeira cask. There's all sorts of wine cask finishes. I think it's people. The category isn't what it used to be, and it was for the longest time it was only blends. Scotch was like blended, and that was how you drank it, and then you got this new category of single malts, and this category of single malts has been around for a while, and I think that there was I know for us with the Balvenie, we're so proud of talking about David Stewart because he was one of the pioneers of cask finishing. So he did the sherry cask finish of Doublewood, and now it's sort of standard practice across single malt category to finish your whiskey in something. So I think it's great for distilleries to and is it a trend? Like, I guess you could call it a trend, but it seems like it's sort of made its own genre, like its own sort of thing. Like you kind of expect now that you're going to get a PDX finish and you're going to get this kind of finish, and to play with it a little bit. I don't think it takes away from the tradition of whiskey making. I think it's sort of like it is a different sort of like category. It's like it's like a different chapter in the book of whiskey. Like I don't even know.
Yeah, no,
that's like a thing, but yeah, I think people want something different. We're not a generation where we have our one whiskey anymore, where we buy our Grants and we just and our or Valentine's or whatever, and that's what we drink, and that's what we always have, our Glenfiddich 12 or our Glenlivet 12. We have whiskey cabinets, plug for Mark's book, whiskey cabinets full of different kinds. So different, and sort of harkening back to what we were just talking about, different day, different context, different flavor, something different, something interesting, something new, something with a little bit of spice to it, something with a little bit of sweetness to it, something that's a little whatever. So I think I guess, sure, it's a great trend.
Yeah,
I love it.
I think so. I mean, it's, looking at it historically, I think the one major change the last 15 years is there's a lot of distilleries that made whiskey just for blended whiskey. So your Diageo, for Johnny Walker. Johnny Walker owns whatever, how many distilleries, 30 distilleries, and you would never taste whiskey from those distilleries because everything they make goes into Johnny Walker. There's a lot of good examples of distilleries that we've just started to taste because they never bottled before as a single malt Scotch. So now you've got a lot more distilleries selling single malt Scotch. Well, how do you make it all taste different? I mean, there's subtleties in everything, right? So every distillery is going to make its own product. The still is different. If you go to any distillery, you talk to anybody, there's a million reasons why that whiskey tastes different. But especially for a new category of drinkers, it's all going to taste very similar. So now how do you change that? A little bit of Madeira cask, a little bit of wine cask, and they're delicious additions and not cheap. Your Madeira casks are so expensive. I mean, these aren't ways distilleries are trying to make a little bit extra buck here. There's, with the exception, I mean, maybe wine barrels are, well, even wine barrels aren't cheap. Like nothing's cheap. Wine barrels are used until they die. Like to buy a wine barrel is a thing, and to age whiskey in these smaller barrels is also a thing. So nothing's done, I think, in a way of hiding anything. It's just it is an interesting trend, and I think it's produced a lot of great whiskeys. And I think my opinion's changed on this the most in the last 5 years. I think 5 years ago I would have been like, yeah, it's a little too trendy, gimmicky. But I think whiskey makers, who doesn't like a good gimmick? But like whiskey makers have started they're just doing such a great job of what they're producing now. I love all the new products coming out.
Agreed. This is actually a personal question for you, and I'm going to keep it in. What did you study at university that made you so knowledgeable? And what university did you go to?
Wow, yeah. So I went to the York University of Toronto.
As did I. Cheers to York University alumni.
That's right. I forgot about that.
I did.
Oh, cheers to that. And York University had a lot of bars. A lot of. I mean, I don't know. We're a little bit. I went to university in the early 2000s, late 90s.
Right.
Back then, the bars were just like these dingy but they were typically Irish type bars, and they had whiskey, and they typically had Scotch, because that's the way Irish bars work in Canada. But yeah, that was always fond memories of that.
What did you study, Mark?
Oh, computer science. Yeah.
I mean, I studied psychology, so obviously I'm going to end up in booze. Just kidding.
Oh boy.
Makes total sense. Okay, I already asked you a question, so it's your turn.
Oh, right, it's my turn. Okay, so I'm down to my last one. I already stole a few questions from you. What is the oldest distillery in the world? This is another quick answer, but right?
Yeah, so I guess the quick answer is Bushmills.
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 It says it on the bottle, so it's got to be true.
Woo!
That wasn't. There we go. No, but if you go to Wikipedia page, if you read the book, The Whisky Cabinet.
The Whisky Cabinet.
It will say Bushmills is the oldest distillery in the world. The since revised history has been like, it's maybe the most oldest license to produce whiskey distillery in the world, but they probably didn't start making whiskey the day or even the year or the decade they got a license to make whiskey. So, like how governments do something, they're like, oh yeah, we're gonna let this happen totally. We got our license, we're gonna let these people do this. And then the people just never do anything because it's a stall tactic. What I'm thinking is that in the 1400s, the king was like, sure, well, here, you can make whiskey, but you're not making a drop of it. And then I'm making things up, by the way. I'm not a historian. Again, computer science. Not a clue. But some of the conventional wisdom now is that it's not the oldest distillery that has the oldest government-approved license to make whiskey.
When you think about the history of whiskey, it makes sense that we probably kind of don't actually know what the oldest distillery would be, given the records would be not so well kept, as whiskey was not always a legal venture.
No, and a lot of farmers made whiskey. Pretty much, if you're a farmer and you farmed grain, you made whiskey because you have grain left over at the end of the season. Your choices are either it will spoil, you make beer and it'll spoil, or you make whiskey and you've got something you can sell or trade. It was largely used for trade, but so it makes a big difference. Yeah. All right.
So there you go. Great. So I've got the last question.
You got the last question.
Which is some thoughts on the Scotch Whisky Association.
Ooh.
Do you think they are protecting the industry, or are they hurting by preventing innovation? Is tradition getting in the way of progress?
Oh.
Interesting.
So I remember getting this question at the Barry Scotch Whisky Society, and I remember going like, I asked me after the thing. This is too big of an issue. As with any industry, the Scotch industry has an association run by like a board, and they define what Scotch is, and they protect the traditions.
Yes.
It's a little different than some countries. Like I think like bourbon is defined by federal law.
Right.
So if you would ever have debates about what bourbon is, it would be like Congress and the Senate and the president would sign off on it. So you know it's never going to happen. Just not. So that's the way it's done in the U.S. In Canada, it's just some dude's desk. I'm sure he's just signing things. I don't know. It's also legislative. In Canada, it's also legislative. But the way I look at the Scotch Whisky Association is it's a little different, I guess. It's a little more politicized. And so some of the things recently Diageo wanted to make, wants to use tequila barrels and talk about finishing barrels, wine, sherry, what have you. They want to use tequila barrels.
Right.
And whether or not that's allowed, that's a decision the Scotch Whisky Association is going to make. Whether that could be still sold as Scotch. So I don't know. I don't know what the answer to this question is. I think it depends who you ask.
It's highly debatable. Exactly.
Yeah.
It's one of those things that you could probably do an entire episode on, just whether or not, you know, they're the tradition versus innovation. And then you've got people that are, you know, firmly on the side of tradition, and you know, purists in terms of their whiskey, and they want their whiskey one way or whatever. And then you've got people that are like, well, let's see what we can do with this category. Like, let's see where it can go. Doesn't mean tradition gets thrown out the window, but let's see what we can use to build on. And then probably you have some people who are in it to make a buck, and they don't really care about tradition whatsoever. So, you know, you could sort of make an argument for any one of those pockets.
Yeah.
And yeah, that's one of those ones you just put the bottle in the middle of the table and get your whiskey buddies around and just start having
debating.
a conversation. Exactly. That's one of those nights.
Because I can tell you, that's true. We've had guests on the show. Yeah. I know Mark Rayner is probably the most memorable, and he was like, yeah, if you do, you know, he doesn't like the way they define Irish whiskey in Ireland and how that definition was, that they think it's too broad, and he certainly has. There's a lot of opinions. In the notes, I'll post a few podcasts. You can listen to people that know about this stuff and this topic more than we do, just because we don't make whiskey, so we don't know if it's different. Yeah, we just talk about it. Yeah, great.
That was great.
That was excellent.
What a good, insightful. Those were some great questions.
They were. They're all.
Maybe we shouldn't have thrown them.
I know. Now we got to clean up after ourselves. Thank you to Delta for providing this room for us. That was really nice, lovely.
Char number 5. Awesome whiskey bar, downtown Toronto. Yeah.
Come
here and hang out.
Absolutely. And if you liked what you saw, you can subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Google Play, all that kind of good stuff.
Yeah.
Or YouTube now, apparently. If this works out, I have no idea.
This might never see the light of day.
Yeah. In which case, all right. Cheers.
Cheers.